The most powerful empire on earth was not built by an army. It has no flag, no capital, no king. And yet, every single weekend, more than 1 billion human beings surrender to it, willingly, joyfully, sometimes through tears. It is played barefoot on the red dirt of Africa, on rooftops in Tokyo, in the alleys of Buenos Aires, where children learn to move a ball before they learn to write their names. It stops civil wars. It starts riots. It turns ordinary men into gods, and gods just as quickly into ordinary men. We call it football. And here is the strange thing, the thing almost nobody knows. None of this was supposed to happen. There was no grand plan, no visionary, no founding genius who looked at a leather ball and saw the future of the human race. Modern football, the global empire, the billion-dollar machine, the religion of the streets, began on a cold autumn night in 1863 in the back room of a London tavern, with a group of angry men shouting at each other about one absurd question. Should players be allowed to kick each other in the shins? That argument split a room in half. It split a sport in two, and it accidentally set in motion a chain of events that would conquer the entire world. This is the story of how it happened, and why it very nearly didn't. To understand that night in the tavern, you first have to understand the chaos that came before it. Because in the mid-1800s, football was not a sport. It was an argument waiting to happen. Every English school played its own version of the game, and every version was a different universe. At Eton, you could barely use your hands. At rugby school, you could pick up the ball and run with it like a thief fleeing the scene of a crime. At Harrow, the ball was shaped like a pillow. In Sheffield, working men had invented their own rules entirely, with corner kicks and crossbars no southern gentleman had ever seen. Imagine it. Two teams meet on a field. One side believes catching the ball is the heart of the game. The other believes it's cheating. There is no referee on earth who can save them. And here lies the question that should haunt every historian of sport. How can a game spread if nobody can agree on what the game actually is? Enter a man history has almost forgotten, a young London solicitor named Ebenezer Cobb Morley. Not an athlete of legend, not a giant of his age, just a meticulous, slightly obsessive lawyer who rode on the Thames, captained a small football club, and could no longer stand the madness. Morley did what lawyers do. He wrote a letter. He proposed that football should have what cricket already had, one set of rules, one game, for everyone. In October 1863, representatives of a dozen clubs answered his call. They gathered at the Freemasons' Tavern in central London. Candlelight, tobacco smoke, beer on the tables, and founded something they decided to call the Football Association. It sounds civilized. It was anything but. Over 6 meetings, across 6 increasingly hostile weeks, these men fought over the soul of the game. Could you carry the ball? Could you trip a running opponent? And above all, the question that turned gentlemen into enemies, could you hack? Hacking, the deliberate kicking of an opponent's shins. To us, it sounds like assault. To the men of Blackheath Football Club, it was the very essence of manhood. When the committee moved to ban it, Blackheath's representative, Francis Campbell, rose to his feet. And in the smoke of that tavern, he delivered a warning that men would still be quoting a century later.
Abolish hacking and you destroy the courage of the game. Give me a week and I'll bring her a crowd of Frenchmen who could beat you.
Read that again. He was saying, A football without violence is a football for foreigners, for the weak. Morley and his allies held their ground. The vote was taken, hacking was banned, carrying the ball was banned, and Campbell walked out. Blackheath left the Football Association that night and never came back. They would go on to help build a different sport, rugby, a game of strength, collision, and conquest. What remained in that tavern was something else. A game of the feet. A game of skill. On that one night, in that one room, two sports were born from a single argument. One chose power, the other chose grace. But here is what the men in that room could not see. They believed they had simply written some rules for a schoolboy's pastime. They had no idea that history was about to pick up their little game and weaponize it. Rules do not create empires. Something has to carry them. And in the 1860s, Britain had accidentally built the perfect delivery system not for football, but for everything. Smokestacks, steam engines, iron rails stretching across the country like veins. The Industrial Revolution. We are taught that the Industrial Revolution produced textiles, coal, and steel. The textbooks rarely mention its strangest product of all, the modern weekend. Because hidden inside the roar of the factories were three invisible technologies, and without all three, football dies in its cradle. The first technology was time. For most of human history, leisure did not exist for the poor. You worked until the light failed, and then you slept. But in the 1870s, factory reform gave British workers something revolutionary: Saturday afternoons off. Think about what that means. For the first time in history, millions of people in the same cities, in the same streets, were free at exactly the same hour. Standardized labor had created standardized freedom, a vast, synchronized, empty afternoon waiting to be filled. The second technology was the railway. A team in Blackburn could now reach Liverpool in hours instead of days. Rival towns could meet, compete, and, crucially, hate each other on a regular schedule. Without the railway, there are no away matches. Without away matches, there are no leagues. Without leagues, football remains what it always was, a local quarrel in a muddy field. And the third technology was the most dangerous of all: money. Factory workers had wages now, not much, but enough for a ticket. Clubs noticed something extraordinary. If you built a fence around a field, men would pay to stand behind it. That fence changed everything. The moment a spectator pays, football stops being a game people play. It becomes a product people consume. By 1888, a Scottish draper in Birmingham named William McGregor saw the chaos of random fixtures and cancelled matches and wrote a quiet letter to a handful of clubs. His idea was almost boring. Every team plays every other team, home and away, every season. Guaranteed matches, guaranteed crowds, guaranteed money. They called it the Football League. It was the first league of its kind on earth and the template for every sports league that exists today, from the NBA to the Premier League. Football had stopped being a game. It had become a system. But a system is a kind of machine, and every machine, sooner or later, demands an owner. The gentlemen who invented football assumed it would always belong to them. They were about to discover how wrong they were. In the beginning, football belonged to a class. The FA Cup, the oldest knockout competition in the world, was the private playground of the southern elite, old Etonians, old Harrovians, officers and aristocrats who played, in their own words, for the love of the game. They did not train. Training, they sniffed, was rather vulgar. A gentleman wins on natural superiority or he does not deserve to win at all. Meanwhile, in the smoke-blackened towns of the north, something was stirring. Blackburn, Preston, Bolton, towns of cotton mills and coal dust, where football was not a pastime. It was the one 90-minute window in the week when a man was not a machine operator, a miner, a blacksmith. On the pitch, a mill worker could be magnificent. And the northern clubs committed an unforgivable sin. They took the game seriously. They studied tactics, they practiced passing, some even slipped their best players a few illegal shillings to make sure they turned up. In 1883, the collision finally came, the FA Cup final, the Kennington Oval, London. On one side, old Etonians, aristocrat, the cup holders, the embodiment of everything football was supposed to be. On the other, Blackburn Olympic, a team of weavers, spinners, an iron foundry worker, a plumber, a dental assistant. Legend has it that before the match, one southern gentleman watched the northerners warming up and turned to his companion.
Good heavens! They've actually prepared. That's hardly sporting, is it?
No, old boy. It's worse than that. It's effective.
The match went to extra time. The Etonians, exhausted because gentlemen do not train, began to break. And in the second period of extra time, Jimmy Costley, a cotton spinner from Lancashire, slid the ball past the aristocrats' keeper. 1-0. For the first time in history, the FA Cup left London. It travelled north, on a train, into the hands of working men. Blackburn greeted their team like a returning army. Football had been invented by gentlemen, but it was being perfected by workers. And that victory detonated a question the gentlemen had been dreading. A question about those quiet, illegal shillings. A question with the power to destroy the sport entirely. If working men are now the best players in England, shouldn't somebody pay them? Every revolution eventually has to answer one question. What do we do about money? To the southern amateurs, the answer was sacred. Football must never be a job. The moment a man is paid to play, the game is corrupted. It becomes labor, commerce, trade. And a gentleman does not engage in trade. It was a beautiful ideal. It had only one flaw. It was a lie. Because a mill worker who misses a Saturday shift to play football loses a day's wages, and his family eats less that week. Playing for love is easy when you have a fortune. It is impossible when you have hungry children. Amateurism, dressed up as purity, was really something else, a lock on the door, designed to keep the working class out. So the northern clubs cheated magnificently. They invented fake jobs that required no work. They stuffed money into boots. They found Scottish players mysteriously willing to relocate hundreds of miles south for the sheer love of Lancashire. The FA investigated, clubs were suspended, accusations flew, and then, in 1884, the North stopped apologising and issued a threat. Dozens of clubs announced they were prepared to walk out and form their own rebel organisation, a British Football Association, where professionalism would be legal. Picture the men of the FA staring at that letter. They were holding the same decision that destroys empires. Hold the line on principle and watch the sport split in two forever. Or surrender the ideal and survive. In July 1885, the gentlemen of the FA did something genuinely rare in history. They blinked. Professionalism was legalized. Players could be paid openly and legally. Many amateurs called it the death of football. It was the opposite. It was the moment football chose survival over purity. And if you want to know what the other road looked like, look at rugby. 10 years later, rugby faced the very same question and refused to compromise. The sport tore itself in half. into rugby union and rugby league, a wound that took a century to heal. Football stayed whole. One game, one set of rules, rich and poor inside the same sport. It now had laws, it had leagues, it had money, it had millions of players. There was only one thing left for it to find: a world. Before football could conquer the planet, something had to happen to the game itself. Something invisible. Something most people in the stadium that day didn't even realize they were watching. November 1872. Glasgow. England versus Scotland. The first official international football match ever played anywhere on Earth. 4,000 spectators, 2 nations, and, as it turned out, 2 completely different ideas of what football was. The English played the game the way English public schools had always played it, the dribbling game. One brave individual takes the ball and charges forward, alone, through the enemy, like a cavalry officer leading a charge. It was heroic, it was personal, it was, in a word, aristocratic. The Scots could not match them. The English players were bigger, heavier, stronger. By every law of Victorian logic, Scotland should have been overrun. Instead, the Scots did something that looked, to English eyes, almost like cowardice. They passed the ball. Instead of one man fighting 11 men shared the fight. The ball moved faster than any player could run. The English giants charged at shadows. The crowd watched something they had no name for yet, a team. The final score was 0-0. On paper, the most boring result in sport. Don't believe the paper, because the most important thing that happened that day was not a goal. It was a pass. That single idea, that football is played not by heroes, but by systems of men, is the genetic code of everything that came after. The great Hungarian sides, Dutch total football, Barcelona's tiki-taka, Pep Guardiola's geometry. Every triangle, every 1-2, every move that makes a stadium gasp, all of it descends from a handful of outnumbered Scots who decided that intelligence could beat strength. Football was no longer just a sport with rules. It was now a language, and languages have a dangerous property. Anyone can learn them, and everyone who learns them changes them. Football did not spread by invasion. It spread by accident in the luggage of the largest commercial empire on Earth. British sailors played it on the docks of Buenos Aires, and Argentine boys stood watching at the fence. British railway engineers carried it to Uruguay and Brazil. British merchants and schoolmasters planted it in Genoa, in Bilbao, in Vienna. Look at the names that survive like fossils. In Italy, the club is not Milano. It is A.C. Milan, the English spelling. The game arrived speaking English. But it did not stay English for long. Because here is what the British never understood. When you give the world a language, the world writes its own poetry. In Argentina, on cramped, dusty streets, the game turned cunning and intimate, la nuestra, ours. In Brazil, it absorbed rhythm and improvisation until it became o jogo bonito, the beautiful game. In Italy, it became tactical, suspicious, a game of chess. The same rules, utterly different souls. And Britain? Britain watched all of this with magnificent indifference. When FIFA was founded in 1904, the British associations sneered at it. When the World Cup was created in 1930, England simply refused to attend for 3 tournaments in a row. Why compete for a world title, the thinking went, when everyone already knows who invented the game? The masters do not sit examinations. History has a particular appetite for that kind of arrogance. In 1950, England finally deigned to enter the World Cup and met a team of part-timers from the United States, a hearse driver, a mailman, a dishwasher. England lost 1-0. Newspapers back home assumed the Wire report was a misprint. But the true execution came 3 years later, in 1953, at Wembley Stadium itself, the cathedral of football, where England had never lost to a team from outside the British Isles. The opponent, Hungary, the mighty Magyars of Ferenc Puskás, a short, round-faced genius, the English dismissed on sight. England player, in the tunnel, reportedly,
"Look at that little fat chap. We'll murder this lot."
90 minutes later, the scoreboard read, England 3, Hungary 6. 6 at Wembley. The Hungarians played a fluid, rotating, position-swapping football the English defenders literally could not comprehend. One England captain said, chasing Puskás was like trying to tackle a ghost. The Empire's long afternoon was over, and the lesson was carved into history in a single, perfect sentence. Britain taught the world football, and the world taught Britain how to play it. Step back now. Look at the whole chain, because no one ever designed it. An argument about kicking shins in a London tavern produced a rulebook. The rulebook met the factory, and the factory donated 3 gifts: free Saturdays, fast railways, and workers with coins in their pockets. The workers seized the game from the gentleman who invented it and forced it to become a profession. Professions need competitions. Competitions crossed borders, and a goalless match in Glasgow taught the ball to be passed, which meant it could be spoken in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Italian, in 200 dialects of genius the inventors never imagined. Every link in that chain was an accident, a quarrel, a compromise, a surrender. And that, perhaps, is the secret. Football was never destined to conquer the world. It had no emperor, no army, no scripture, no government behind it. It had only 3 things. Rules simple enough for anyone to share. A ball cheap enough for anyone to afford or to make, from rags and string and hope. And stories powerful enough that everyone, everywhere, wanted to belong to one. The empires of the 19th century are gone. Their flags came down, their borders dissolved. But every weekend, in 100 and more countries, the empire, born in a smoky tavern, still rises in cathedrals of light, holding 80,000 voices. And in dusty streets, where a child in a faded shirt bends a ball of rags around an imaginary defender, and, for one perfect second, becomes immortal. The British invented football. The working class built it. The world reinvented it. And now it belongs to everyone.